Let's now talk a bit about dyes. The main advantage for using these for detection, as opposed to enzymes which you would use in chemiluminescent detection, is that the intensity of the signals is not affected by enzymatic activity, and therefore they will be stable, in stark contrast to the dynamic signals which are produced by an enzymatic reaction. When working within the linear range of an assay, these signals are also directly proportional to the amount of detected antibody, allowing for accurate and reliable quantification of the relative abundance of the targets. Consequently, fluorescence is the detection method of choice for the most accurate quantitative Western blot assays. As a reminder, detection is achieved by first exciting the fluorophore using an appropriate light source, such as a laser, which is tuned to excite the dye at its peak excitation wavelength. When it is excited, the dye will fluoresce, meaning that it gives off light at a slightly different wavelength to that which was used for excitation. The emitted light signal can be measured by an appropriate detector, such as an avalanche photodiode or a camera chip. If our imaging system has multiple detectors, each tuned to a different specific wavelength, then it is possible to multiplex the detection. That is, to detect multiple different targets at the same time, even if the bands co-migrate and overlap. This can be achieved in practice by using different primary antibodies for each of your targets of interest, each one raised in a different host species, and then using different secondary antibodies, each from another independent host species, and each conjugated to fluorophores that can be detected separately. There are two different classes of dyes to choose from in order to label secondary antibodies for fluorescent detection. The first are the visible dyes. These emit light in the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which runs from about 400 to 670 nanometers. Although there are many visible dyes to choose from, including those commonly used for fluorescence microscopy such as Psi3 and Psi5, the major limitation that they have is poor detection sensitivity for Western blots. This is because the vast majority of material, including the membrane, as well as the reagents and samples themselves, will also exhibit high levels of fluorescence at visible wavelengths, which will also be picked up by the detector. This phenomenon is known as autofluorescence, and detection of these signals, in addition to the dye-specific signal that we are trying to detect, results in very high background and poor signal-to-noise. Now, it's all well and good if you have very high signal from your bands, but if the background is very high as well, as would be the case using visible dyes for detection, you'll have a really tough time identifying those signals above the background level, and sensitivity will be poor as a result. What we really want is to reduce the background level, so we can better identify signals above it, and therefore increase overall detection sensitivity. And an easy way to do that is to use another class of dyes, and that is the near-infrared, or NIR dyes. These dyes emit light in the near-infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which starts at around 680 nanometer wavelength. Here, autofluorescence from most material is greatly reduced, and this leads to higher signal-to-noise ratios, and as a result, greatly increased detection sensitivity. For example, in the blot on the left in this figure, imaged using a visible dye, we can see very high background, and even the strongest bands are difficult to distinguish above the background level. However, in the blot on the right, which was imaged using an NIR dye, we can clearly see that the background has been dramatically reduced, and even the weaker bands in the dilution series can now be easily distinguished. Generally speaking, using appropriate detection hardware, near-infrared fluorescent detection sensitivity is much higher than can be achieved with visible wavelengths, and is comparable to that which can be achieved using chemiluminescent detection. Although there aren't as many fluorophores to choose from as there are for visible wavelengths, it is still possible to use two dyes, typically one at 700 nanometers and the other around 800 nanometers, to multiplex the detection in a near-infrared range, while still yielding high signal-to-noise ratios for both of the targets. With optimized detection hardware, such as an Odyssey family imager, signals at these two wavelengths can be detected completely independently, and can allow for detection of two targets across their whole combined linear range. For more information on why determining the combined linear range is critical for a quantitative Western blot assay, and some advice on how to do so, please consult the Linear Range for Quantitative Western Blots course here on Lambda U. Although it may be tempting to multiplex further channels by adding a visible wavelength to the mix, you should be aware of the potential pitfalls involved, chief among which is the fact that the visible channel is likely to have comparatively poor signal-to-noise ratio due to the high autofluorescence from the membrane, and is therefore unlikely to allow individual targets to be quantified over the same combined linear range as those in the near-infrared channels. But in practice, you are very unlikely to need to detect 3 or more bands that have exactly the same molecular weight, so having 2 channels is virtually always enough. Besides, if you do need to detect more targets, it's still possible to multiplex further without adding more channels, provided that each of the targets is uniquely identifiable by its molecular weight. For example, in this blot, 3 targets, phospho-AKT, total ERK, and COX-4, have been detected in one channel, which is shown in green, and 2 further targets, total AKT and phospho-ERK, are detected in the other channel, shown in red, for a total of 5 targets detected at once. For multiplex detection to work well, you should always first check that each of your primary-secondary antibody pairs will be specific and do not result in non-specific bands. Also remember, when probing for targets which have the same or similar molecular weight, primary antibodies need to come from different host species, and the secondary antibodies need to come from another independent host species, with each individual secondary antibody labelled with a uniquely identifiable fluorophore. The exception to this rule is if you only have primary antibodies from the same host species available, but they are from different IgG subclasses. These can still be detected independently using subclass-specific secondary antibodies whenever they are available. It's also very important to choose highly cross-adsorbed antibodies for multiplexing. Cross-adsorption, also known as pre-adsorption, is an extra purification step involved in the production of an antibody, which is used to improve specificity and prevent cross-reactivity to other similar species. In this process, an antibody product is passed through a column filter containing serum proteins from potentially cross-reactive species, which capture any antibody molecules which would otherwise cross-react in your assays. This is critical for multiplex experiments because without cross-adsorption, secondary antibodies would recognize and bind to primary antibodies other than those to which they were intended. The result would be non-specific bands appearing in the other detection channel. Remember, if you're ever struggling to find a combination of primary and secondary antibodies which will work for you, you can always contact a LICOR expert for advice. We have now looked at secondary antibodies in the Western blot assay in some detail, so in the next lesson, we'll go through the recommended protocol for incubating your membrane with the secondary antibodies.